Dan St.Yves, and today I'm talking to Dave Astor, who's a columnist. He's got a Montclairvoyant humor column for the Montclair, New Jersey Times, blogs about books at daveastoronliterature.com, and he's the author of this delightful memoir / recollection of his time, 25 years spent covering syndicates, celebrities, and the changes over the last 25 years in the media world, comic and column Confessional. So thanks so much for taking time in the middle of this hectic conference here in Indianapolis, Dave.
You're welcome, Dan.
So what I want to do is touch really quickly on 25 years you were able, with editor and publisher, to cover the cartoonist and columnist beat. And literally you touched on every big name in the industry, plus I guess there would have been other lesser lights, but you got to meet and interview many of the big greats. Do you think, having had that stretch, in the comic world they refer to the golden and silver age of comics, was there that sort of thing as far as cartoon strips go?
I guess, well, I was editor and publisher from 1983 to 2008, and in the 1980s and into the 1990s, it was probably the tail end of the golden age for comics, because there were still a lot of newspapers around. Newspapers were making a lot of money, so they were buying a lot of comics, and a number of people could make a living with comics. So it was going pretty well then. I mean, some people consider the golden age to be before World War II, when comics sort of first exploded. You know, like when things are new and fresh, sometimes that's considered the best of times. But things did really go well until, you know, roughly the year 2000. Then with the advent of the internet, it gave cartoonists the opportunity to do webcomics. Tons of them were posted, and a lot of them were really great, but it wasn't a great way to make money, like a lot of things on the web. So comics, print comics, I guess, newspapers, because of the competition from the web, were sort of not as profitable as they used to be. People were getting their news online, not in print, and you know, to a great extent. So when newspapers started to struggle, comics started to struggle along with it, and newspapers began running fewer comics, shrinking them to save on space and newsprint costs and so on. So there was great talent, probably as great talent then as there was decades before, but they just didn't have the print opportunity quite as much.
Well, it's interesting because at one point, comic strips in the newspaper were so influential, they were running in thousands of papers.
Yep.
The cartoonists were making huge amounts of money, but there were plush toys, movies, TV specials, and then all of a sudden things, like you say, just kind of there's still some degree, like every year you can see Charlie Brown's Christmas and
right.
Thanksgiving, but that sort of influence I don't think we'll ever see again.
Yeah, I agree. It's I guess as the media pie keeps getting sliced, newspapers are not as big a portion of the media world. So with the web, now with social media, with cable TV, when it came in, you know, decades ago, whatever, people have so many options that newspapers are not kind of the king of the media world, and newspaper cartoonists or syndicated cartoonists are not as prominent as they used to be. And I sometimes wonder if some of the most talented cartoonists these days don't even try to get into newspapers. They might go into animation, comic books, graphic novels. I mean, they might just do other things, or maybe not even get into cartooning at all. So.
Yeah. You know, the trend is so juxtaposed with the fact that movie theaters seem to thrive on superhero and comic sort of characters, but that we grew up on in our era like you've talked to some of the greats, you know, the creator of High and Lois, Wizard of Id, Beetle Bailey. It's remarkable, and in your book, I can only touch on a few tidbits here, and I'll try and get a few little anecdotes about some of your encounters, but it is something to see some of the folks that you've brushed along with in your career there. Garfield,
Yeah,
Jim Davis.
Yeah.
Any little story you can share on Jim?
Well, first of all, Jim is a really nice guy. He really paid his dues before he became huge. He was an assistant on a comic called Tumbleweeds.
I remember Tumbleweeds.
Done by Tom K. Ryan for perhaps even a decade or more. And that was kind of a modestly successful comic, but he, like most cartoonists, he really wanted his own thing. So he came up with Garfield. He named Garfield after, I believe, one of his uncles. And his idea behind Garfield was basically to make Garfield a human, but in cat form. Doesn't really act like a cat. I mean, he eats lasagna, he kind of runs the household, he's like the boss. Well, maybe that's like a cat, so he, and in the first few years, it was a hilarious comic. It was kind of sarcastic. It was really fun. Then when Garfield became really huge and got into licensing, plush toys and all that stuff, then Jim Davis hired kind of a whole factory of people to help him, and the comic remained good, but it didn't have quite the individual creative spark that it was kind of done by committee, so it's but it's in, at least as of a couple years ago, it was in 2,000 or more papers, so people still like it, or they're just used to it or whatever, but it does quite well. And of course it went into other media. There was a Garfield TV show, there was a couple of Garfield movies which didn't do as well as the Spider-Man movies.
No.
But a really nice guy. And one interesting thing about Garfield was sometime in the 1990s, Garfield was running neck and neck with Peanuts for a number of newspapers.
Right.
And for many years, Peanuts had the most newspapers of any comic in the world, maybe around 2,500. Garfield was sort of catching up, and then one day in the 1990s, Jim Davis's company, which is called Paws Incorporated, out of Indiana, where we are now.
Oh my gosh!
In Muncie or near Muncie, that they put out a press release saying that Garfield had more newspaper clients than Peanuts, and I contacted the syndicate that handled Peanuts, and they were not happy and skeptical that Garfield had more newspapers, and they said they would get back to me. They did get back to me and gave me the number of newspapers that Peanuts had, and it turned out it was still more than Garfield by maybe 50 papers. I got back to Jim Davis, and he was very gracious. He said, if Peanuts still has more, that's fine. I'm okay with that. And then the end of that story was a few months later, I was at a conference and ran into Charles Schultz, who does Peanuts, and he kind of walked up to me, and he was a very friendly guy and very gracious, but that day he was not happy. He was sort of, grumpy about how Garfield had allegedly had more papers, and he just kind of told me you shouldn't have believed that. But I did check it, but ran a story that Peanuts had more, and that was kind of an example of how Charles Schultz, as nice and as friendly as he was very competitive and very proud of his creation, and he liked to be number one, and that kind of bothered him that he seemingly didn't have the most papers, but he still did.
Well, and you, as you mentioned earlier, Jim Davis started to farm out his cartoon to a staff, and Charles never did.
That's true.
Stuck with that. And you also mentioned in there that when he goes, Peanuts goes.
Yeah, but unfortunately,
it did not happen.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely did it all by himself. The inking, the ideas, the final drawing. He did, of course, have help with all his licensing stuff. He had a whole staff, doing Snoopy dolls and apparel and whatever. Yeah, he told me directly that when he died or retired, that Peanuts would end. But when he died in 2000, his syndicate, I guess, or whatever business interests sort of surrounded him, just couldn't let go of that annual income, so they decided to offer Peanuts classics, reruns of the comic, and most papers ran them. They might have lost 10% of their clientele, but and it was unfortunate because it would have opened up so much space for new cartoonists, and people could have always read Peanuts in books and watched the yearly specials, like you mentioned, Charlie Brown Christmas and so on. So I don't know how many newspapers Peanuts is still in now, but the reruns are still going.
Well, it's interesting that sort of endured beyond his intent, and you also had a chance to get to interview and know one of my fellow Canadians, Lynn Johnson, for better or for worse. And she had a life situation that forced her to kind of continue doing, but in a different way. She was updating her classic columns. Yeah,
she came up with some sort of hybrid where she was rerunning the comics, but occasionally doing new ones, occasionally revising the ones she had already had published. And again, I think, I don't know for sure, but I think she really wanted to completely retire from the comic, but the syndicate, again, didn't, it was such a cash cow or whatever, didn't want to give it up, and I think eventually she was kind of happy to still do it somewhat, but originally I think she might have wanted to just end it completely. Also a very nice person Lynn is, and very talented cartoonist, and I guess probably one of the most famous Canadians there is.
Yeah, definitely exploded, and I remember meeting her years and years and years ago, probably over 25 years ago. So it's that's the thing, is these people had enduring careers. And I've got to move on to columnists here and stuff, but there's an overlap that I want to talk. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to talk at all about Bloom County or The Far Side or Calvin Hobbes, but Calvin Hobbes, I'll squeeze that in because you sort of had a little bit of set off a kerfuffle when you were going to publish a picture of Mr. Waterston.
Yeah, Bill Waterston was very reclusive, kind of the J.D. Salinger of the cartoon world, the Catcher in the Rye author. And when I first, I interviewed him about a year or two after his comic started. It was already becoming wildly popular, and he was still doing interviews then. But when I interviewed him by phone, the syndicate, Universal Press Syndicate, as it was called at the time, sent me his photo, him sitting at a desk, looking sort of like the father in the comic, thin, short, dark hair. And then suddenly I got a call from the syndicate saying, you can't run that photo because Bill doesn't want his photo in the magazine and doesn't want to be recognized on the street or whatever. So I know some journalists would say, well, you sent me the photo, so I'm going to use it, but I was okay with it. I basically was able to run a self-caricature of him sitting at a drawing table with three of his cats kind of draped around the room, and that was fine. And I still actually have the photo, which I've never run, but when I left the magazine, I took the photos I had, and I have them in a couple boxes at home. Then there was one other instance of his reclusiveness. He actually gave a public speech in 1989 at the Ohio State Cartoon Festival. He was the head of that festival and the head of the cartoon library at Ohio State was very friendly with Bill and managed to convince him to give a speech, but no cameras were allowed to take photos of him. I mean, there weren't iPhones or anything back then for people to kind of sneak something, and he couldn't be recorded, and declined to give autographs. I mean, he just, I don't think he was a bad guy. I mean, I think he was a nice guy. He just was very private, and in this hyper media age, when people don't want publicity, they're kind of looked upon as weird. But why not have some privacy if that's what you want? Yeah.
Before we move on to columnists, I want to talk about, because we did mention how movies now have been overtaken by superheroes, and I had forgotten, I used to read religiously the Spider-Man comics. So you were there to interview Stan Lee when he overlapped coming out of the comic book world into the comic strip world.
Yeah, Spider-Man, the comic, I started in the early 60s. I guess Stan Lee co-created it. And in the late 70s, I think, there was a newspaper comic version of it that Stan Lee wrote. He had somebody else draw it. And it did modestly well. It wasn't, the comic book probably was more popular than the comic strip. And I interviewed him in the, around 1983, and extremely friendly, just so outgoing and fun, and he's just a very charismatic guy. And then I guess the Spider-Man movies came later, and as you know, he always had a cameo in them, sort of like Alfred Hitchcock. He'd make one quick appearance, and just a wonderful guy and a living legend. He's still alive, and he's in his 90s now.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much that whole pop culture thing sort of sat in our palm of our hands for so long.
Yeah, and some of us didn't keep those comics. That would be worth a lot of money now.
No kidding.
But one quick thing on Stan Lee. I was at the New York Comic Con in 2008, and he appeared as a speaker. And I mentioned this in my book, but he was being escorted to, I guess, the room he would speak at, and all the attendees saw him, and they went wild. It was like, Beatlemania of the 60s, or nowadays maybe someone seeing Lady Gaga or something, and people were like trailing him and shouting, and he's popular.
Well, he is as iconic as his characters.
Yeah, that's true.
So now we're running out of time here, so I'm going to try and trip over the columnists. You've talked to everybody, every big name. Ann Landers, Dear Abby, Bill O'Reilly, Arianna Huffington, and Art Buchwald. But am I correct that you were the person that broke Dave Barry's actual retirement?
Yeah. That was it. Wasn't anything complicated. He had been on leave, I guess, a sabbatical, and everybody was wondering whether he would make that permanent or not, because he had so many other interests, books and whatever. So I contacted him and said, if you could do an interview about your plans, I'd be happy to do it. And eventually he agreed to do an email interview, and announced that he was not going to go back to newspapers on a weekly basis. He writes occasionally for the Miami Herald, but
he's actually, it seems like they've done a little bit of golden era stuff with him as far as rewriting some of his
that's
stuff.
True. Good point. Yeah, I guess they just can't resist.
Now, you've had a front row seat to the sea change in newspapers, and for cartoonists, columnists, was there any sort of, as you were walking among the gods, is there one particular experience that you had that really stands out?
With columnists or?
Columnists, cartoonists, whatever.
Yeah. Well, one thing with, again, the competition thing, like between Charles Schultz and Jim Davis, Dear Abby and Ann Landers were
right.
twin sisters,
yeah.
Both born on July 4th, 1918 maybe. And Ann Landers took over what was also the Ann Landers column in 1955 at the Chicago Sun-Times, and became associated with that name, but she wasn't the one who started it, and was doing really well. And then her sister, Dear Abby, Abigail Van Buren, a year later said, I wanted to do a column too, and she went to, I believe it was the San Francisco Chronicle, and said, I think my advice column could be better than the one you have in the paper, and they asked her to do kind of a test, and she passed it with flying colors. So she started a column, And Ann Landers was really annoyed at that. Her sister was kind of honing in on her territory. As it turned out, they both had a lot of newspapers. Ann Landers tended to have maybe more larger papers, but there was room for both, and they pretty much reconciled after a while. But they were always kind of very conscious of each other. One time, I ran a story, and I think I ran Dear Abby's photo bigger just because it was a better photo, and Ann Landers, kind of contacted me, why did you do that? And another time I ran Ann Landers' photo larger, and she wrote me a thank you note for doing that. And they were real characters, those two. Very, very, very talented.
Well, I wish we could. I mean, this thing, as I say, comic and column Confessional is just jam-packed with memories and personal memories too. It's a memoir of your experience and your life. I wish I could go on and on and on about this, but we'll get some links here on how you can get a copy of this. But Dave, fascinating stuff, and thanks so much for taking some time.
Oh, thank you.